The question I asked on Twitter last week was for an article that I was working on about what are people's just general best tips for managing a remote team? And it had a ton of responses. And I'm really curious to hear from your perspective, like what your major takeaways have been from managing successfully a remote team.
Yeah, thanks for asking. And yeah, I was following that thread, and I feel like there was, I don't know if there was hundreds, but there was a lot. Yeah, there's a lot. And I thought a lot of them were really quite good. And I wrote back saying, hey, we're doing this thing, so let's talk about it instead. So I've got a number of tips, but I was kind of curious about sort of maybe to start what category, and I've got some time. I don't know how much time you have, but we can kind of go as long as we need to, as long as we exhaust the topic. But I mean, are you curious about tips from the employer's point of view, employee's point of view, like day-to-day work? Can you kind of give me a little bit more sense of at least the starting angle? Maybe we could cover all of it, but kind of where would you like me to start?
Yeah, so I'm curious about both sides of the equation. I'm somebody who has worked from home as an independent contractor for 6 years now. So curious from my own perspective as kind of a remote member of a lot of different teams as a freelancer. And then for the sake of the article I was writing, it was more from the company perspective of like, how can we do this in the best possible way?
Yeah, okay. Well, so one of the things I'm going to start with is talking about communication methods, because I mean, this is fundamental and critical to making this work. What we've seen is that while real-time communication can be handy at times, more asynchronous communication is better for remote working. And let me explain what that means. So real-time would be chat, like discussing everything in real time, like line at a time. You say something, I say something, you say something, someone else says something. You get this long transcript, one line at a time. And part of the problem with that is that when you're working with remote people, you've got to keep in mind that not everybody's on the same time zone. Now, in some cases, some people are. You may have you may just all live in the same area, but you don't have an office, so you work remotely. That might be a little bit different, but in many cases, people are spread across time zones. And if you're speaking in real time about things and discussing things in real time, then what you tend to do is end up pulling people into conversations beyond a standard workday, because it might be 3 o'clock for you, but it might be 7 o'clock for someone else. And now that this conversation is happening right now, that people feel like they have to be involved. And so people's work days tend to stretch. And I think they end up working too much. So, well, again, we're not opposed to real-time communication, but I think like things more like email-based communication, or in our case with Basecamp, we have message boards, which are like emails, but they're all stored centrally. So you don't have to worry about what's in someone's inbox. You write something up in long form, you send it out, and then the assumption is that people have time to think it over and respond on their own schedule versus responding on a real-time schedule, which is right now. And that's, so if I write something up at 4 o'clock and someone's off work or sleeping or whatever, the assumption is like, we'll talk about it tomorrow, not we'll talk about it right now. So the method matters, because the method creates expectations. So I think it's much better for that perspective to write things in more of a long form, get your full thought out, put it in a place where people can get to it later, and then they can get to it later when it's on their own schedule. So I think that's really important. The other thing that's really important about that specifically is that, when you're onboarding a new employee who's remote, like for example, Andy, who works for us now, is our newest employee. He lives in Detroit. So he's coming in, he's joining the company. We've been around for 20 years. So there's a lot of history, okay? If I want him to get caught up and like get up to speed on sort of how we communicate, the things we've talked about in the company, how we take feedback, how we provide feedback, how we give critique, how we review work, to ask him to go back and read a flat transcript that might go back 3 or 4 years, it's like, that's no way to get up to speed on something, right? You want things broken out into topics that are clear, that have conversations that are related to the thing above it. And so to have more of an asynchronous style, message board style thing where things are broken out over time based on subject that have clear headings, it's easy for someone to go in and then read that thing and then read the comments that pertain directly just to that thing and get up to speed over time in a much more organized, manageable way than just giving someone like a flat stack of paper and saying, read everything that we've talked about over 2 years. Like, it's just very hard to get up to speed that way. So I think it's when you organize your communication around long form communication that's more asynchronous based on subjects and titles and more of a traditional email style, it's easier for people to get up to speed and know where to dive in and where they, you know, what's interesting to them and what isn't, versus reading things in a time-based manner. So those are two of the fundamental things. The other thing I think is really important is, and I sort of alluded to a little bit, is writing things up as complete ideas. So, and this is really important, especially with remote workers, because in person, people tend to talk back and forth, and you kind of have a chance in some ways to sort of round out an idea in person. And there's sort of these social norms that when someone else is speaking, you kind of don't break in, that sort of thing around a table. But remotely, when there's a chat room, when you're talking about things in a chat room, like, people tend to jump in because you don't know when someone's done with a thought and you don't know how much is left. And so we encourage people to write things up in detail, which means like a long form writing. It could be 3 or 4 or 5 paragraphs to get the whole idea out at once so people can absorb that idea at once when they're reading it, versus having to read scene interjection from someone else, read scene interjection from someone else. Something goes off track. You don't really know when it's done. Things tend to devolve and that sort of thing. So that style of communication, I think, is really important, especially for remote people. I can go on and on about that, but I'll stop there. Does that resonate, or does that make sense, or am I being clear?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it really touched on, like you said, a couple of things that other folks said in the comments on that Twitter thread. One, about the different time zones, about how you could have one meeting that's 7 a.m. for one person and 6 p.m. for another person. And that represents totally different states of mind for those different employees. So you're catching people at different times of day, different energy levels, stress levels, things like that. So I think that's a huge point that you touched on that makes just a ton of sense. And the asynchronous communication really kind of works around that. And then the other thing is I think one of the really difficult things of being part of a remote team is just, like you said, like, there's so much information to pour over. So having the long form content where the idea is all out in one place, it's kind of that Amazon silent meeting approach where everyone reads the memo together first in the meeting. We're all on the same page. We've all absorbed it. It's fresh. And then you can go from there. So you get past the people who are bluffing, who didn't really read the memo, or, you know, all those things. So I think that all just makes a lot of sense.
It also, yeah, I've always loved that. I'm assuming Amazon still does that. I've heard about that over the years. And I love that approach, which is like, let's just be honest. Not everyone has time to read everything ahead of time, right? People come to meetings unprepared all the time. So,
yes.
But there's more to it than that. It's not just reading it together. It's actually that someone else had to form a complete thought and write it up in a way that people could absorb it. And that's really important, extremely important. And in a lot of companies these days, when everything has moved to real-time communication and you're thinking and speaking one line at a time, people don't have a chance to make a full point because people jump in. And then it just sort of devolves. So I love that. I think that's really important. I think the other thing that's really important here is people, especially like in the software world, people talk about how important documentation is. And this isn't just software. This is all sorts of things. What's really nice about writing things, especially long form, is that you're documenting decisions along the way that are easy to reference. It's one thing, like some people would say, well, we talked about this stuff in all these different chat rooms. It's like, okay, but is it easy to reference later? If it's not easy to reference, you should just assume it's not there. And so one of the nice things about like really putting things in specific categories of like writing posts with subjects is that they can easily be referenced later. You can browse a list of topics and go, oh, that's the one I'm looking for, or that's the one I'm looking for. So documenting decisions it's important for new people, for old people, for everybody to look, well, I don't mean new and old, young, savvy veterans internally or newbies, you know, it's really important to be able to reference stuff easily. That's really key here. The other thing I was going to say about one of the real advantages of remote work is it gives you an opportunity to have to avoid distractions that typically occur in a physical environment. So when everybody works in the same office together, it's just much easier to go and tap someone on the shoulder, call someone's name, be distracted by a phone call. There's some sounds, there's smells from lunch, like lunch is happening. Like I can't think now because like someone's, eating a delicious hamburger, like there's a lot of distractions in the physical world. So one of the advantages to remote work is you can eliminate most of those, but you also want to make sure that you don't add new ones. So one of the things that we suggest is to make sure you have notifications off for most things, and that you don't feel tempted to have to check in on stuff all the time. Like, use remote to your advantage. Don't try to simulate what it's like to be in physical space. I know there's some products out there which have this like idea of constant video chat. Like you can kind of see everybody all the time. Like, to me, that's actually, that's the wrong approach. I think you don't want to simulate what it's like to be around everybody. What you do actually want to do is take advantage of the differences. And so with remote, people can create their own environments. In many cases, they can create their own work hours. In many situations, they can create their own sort of cozy space. And so I would encourage people to do so and take advantage of that, not just try to make it feel like you're physically with everybody else.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And yes, that is like when I worked in an office, that was the number one thing, was somebody would just pop into your office and then, oh, it's been an hour, and it takes you however many minutes to get back on track doing what you were doing before. So yeah, totally, I think that makes a lot of sense.
It's like sleep. I've talked about this before, but it's like sleep. If you're sleeping and somebody interrupts you, or there's a loud sound or whatever, right? You get jostled out of sleep and you don't fall right back asleep. Like, it takes some time to get back to sleep. The same thing is true for work. If you're focused on something and someone distracts you, you don't just get right back to work after they go away. There's switching costs. And there's mental, there's switching costs, that there's like focus costs. I don't know what the costs are, what you want to call them, but clearly, like, you've been distracted and your that moment has been broken into before and after. And the more fragmented your day, the harder it is to get anything meaningful done. Mm-hmm. And so remote is great because you can hopefully shield yourself more from those kinds of things that would distract you and break your day into smaller and smaller bits. Not always, but you have a better shot at it. So like, take advantage of that. I'm trying to think of some other interesting tips. I think though, what is important, of course, is that remote work can cause isolation for some. And it is an isolating thing, clearly. And some people love that, right? Other people do not. I mean, no one really probably likes true isolation, but some people probably do, but it's not probably a healthy thing for most. So one of the things we do, like at Basecamp, is we try to encourage people to share a little bit more about their life, things that they might normally share over lunch, or, that they don't really get to share remotely because they don't have those personal moments with other people. So for example, Basecamp asks, the product Basecamp asks everybody every Monday morning, like, what'd you do this weekend? And it's totally optional for people to answer this. No one has to do this, but people share pictures of trips or their family or things they did over the weekend, or, they went apple picking, or they, were playing with their kids, or they visited their grandparents, or they went on some hike, or whatever it might be. And it's just a really nice way to inject a little bit of the human side of someone's life that you would get to know a little bit more if you were in person with them, but it's hard to get to know if you're remote. So I do think that those sorts of moments are really important. And while it's not a tip for like how to work more efficiently, it's a way to get to know your teammates better, which ultimately I think provides a broader perspective, which ultimately I think helps you understand them better as people, which ultimately, like, if you really want to tie it down, helps you work better with those people. So I think that's a really important thing to do, is to find those moments where you can share something about your life completely optionally. But I think that's critical. A lot of the times when we talk about remote work, we're just talking about work. And people have a life outside of work, and that's interesting. That's what makes them who they are. So I think that's key too.
Yeah, I love that you touched on that, because for me, I'm south of Chicago. I live in a pretty rural part of Illinois. And so the isolation is very real, especially in the winter months when if you work from home, I mean, you're spending a lot of time in the same space. So having that human element where you can talk to other people, and that kind of works around the isolation that just kind of naturally happens sometimes when you work alone from home by yourself. I think that's so important. And not just from a work perspective, not just from a productivity perspective, but from a human perspective of like, we all need people to vent to on a bad day or to celebrate with on a good day.
Totally. And And some of those things aren't even work related. Like
Mm-hmm.
maybe you have a kid and they walked for the first time this weekend,
Mm-hmm.
and like you want to talk to someone about that or show a video or whatever it might be. Like these are those kind of moments that do tend to happen more frequently when you're local
Mm-hmm.
or when you're close. So the other thing is like other things we do around this are we ask, again, Basecamp asks automatically, I think it's once a month, like, what are you reading? Like, what books are you reading? I think we ask every 2 weeks. Again, this is all completely automated through the product, which is key. You want something automated because if you have to remember to ask people, you typically don't because it gets squeezed out. So just like set it and forget it, basically. And then we ask, like, so what books have you been reading? Like, what's inspired you lately? Have you had a good customer experience somewhere else? Just trying to draw out things for people to share that don't have to do with work. Because again, those are the things that tend to happen in person at some level. So I think that's a really important tip, just to bring a team a little bit closer together. Of course, you don't want people to feel like they have to, like that you're invading their personal space, because some people aren't comfortable sharing anything about their life outside of work. Totally fine. So it's really important to make that an option, like be very clear that that's optional and reinforce that it's optional.
I like that. I think that makes a lot of sense.
I'm trying to think of some other stuff that would be handy to share. One of the things I think that's sort of a little bit harder remotely is like having a sense of what people are working on. For some reason in a physical space, you seem to have more of a shot at like bumping into something that maybe you didn't know was happening, or some companies have like boards or screens around the office that show like stats, or just it's easier to bump into other work serendipitously, I think, when you're in a physical space. So one of the things that we do is we do this for, of course, everything we're talking about, we do this for people who are local and people who are remote. We don't work differently. And I think that's let me just start there. I shouldn't say we don't, because there's always there's always a reality that you want something and then there is something. So like, I don't want there to be different cultures between the local teams and the remote teams, but naturally there's going to be some difference, obviously. So we just have to admit that. But the way we work is we work as if everybody is remote. So very rarely have in-person meetings, and we very rarely have remote meetings. We don't have a culture of meeting in one place but not meeting in other places. It's either we do one thing or we don't do one thing. So I think one of the things that's important for us is that it's important for everybody at the company here to know what everyone else is working on a daily basis. But they shouldn't have to feel like they have to follow or bump into the work that's happening. Like, that's a whole job in itself to try to stay up on a dozen different things that are going on across the company. So every day, at the end of the day, people are prompted automatically by Basecamp to write up what they worked on today. Like, what'd you work on today? And this is in your own words. Some people share 2 bullet points. Some people share a whole paragraph. Some people share a long write-up. It just depends, and it's, again, optional, but most people do it. And it comes down to like how much you want to share. And then you can choose to read that on your own time if you're curious. So there's one place to go to stay up on everything that's happening across the whole company, versus feeling like you have to go out and seek it and search it out or bump into it, which is something you might do locally. So that's another tip I would encourage remote teams especially to do, is to keep everybody in the loop in their own words in a single place, so everyone has a chance to read up on that and get a sense of what's going on.
Yeah. One of the themes I'm hearing through your responses is the importance of kind of taking a vague idea that's maybe gray and then turning it into basically like synthesizing the information, turning it into narrative format, and then being able to share that with other people. So it's not just, ideas floating around in people's head or like things that they want to talk about in the future. You're giving them a way to channel those ideas, that progress, whatever it might be, put it in the written format. And then not only is that helping them with their communication with the team members, but it's forcing them to kind of distill those thoughts into actual words, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and it also it's prompted. So it's automatic. There's a process in place that asks a question. So one of the fundamental things I've learned, this isn't about local or remote, but just in business, is like, if you want an answer from somebody, you have to ask a question. Like, it's very rare that people just volunteer answers. So if you want to know, if you want to help people write and you want to help people share, you have to kind of ask them to do so in a regular way automatically. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So we can say like culturally that it's good to share amongst the team, amongst the company, but unless that's sort of part of a formal automatic process, it probably isn't going to happen as much as it should. The other thing that's nice about these idea of these daily prompts or weekly prompts is that it encourages people to write, like you said, and that gives them practice. It gives them like they're doing reps. And since writing is such a fundamental, like the way most, especially remote teams communicate over time, I know video conferencing is useful too, but like video conferencing is more ephemeral. It happens and then it's not really documented. So it's kind of gone like a meeting in a sense. Even if you record it, it's rare that people are gonna have the time to go back and watch like a 1 hour meeting. I mean, it's boring, first of all. Who's gonna but the idea is that if you encourage people to write, they become better writers. Just like if you want to be a better guitarist, you play every day. If you want to be a better runner, you run more frequently. Like that's what you do. It's practice. So even though this is not why we do it, this nice side effect of encouraging people, and actually not even encouraging, but prompting people to write something every day, is that they get better at explaining themselves, and they also get to reflect back on their day. So here's another thing I think that's important mentally, especially for people who are remote, is sometimes it's hard to actually reflect. You don't get a chance to reflect on your day and feel good about what you accomplished. Because there isn't that moment when we're all sort of together, maybe talking about what we're doing or what we did. So by prompting you at the end of every day to reflect on your day, you get a chance to say, you know, I actually accomplished a lot, or hey, I didn't. That happens too. Like, you know, I was busy all day and I feel like I got nothing done. Like, it's good to reflect on that too. It's good to reflect on that because then you can wonder why. Like, what did I do? What happened? Why not? Like, was there something in my environment that changed? Like, these are just these moments to reflect. And I think that those are really important moments, and especially important for remote workers who don't have the luxury necessarily of having other people reflect on them. So you can almost think of coworkers as mirrors in a sense. Like when you're in a space, there's more mirrors. So you have a better sense of like, when you're around coworkers, I should say, there's more mirrors. So you have a better sense of reflection. But when you're by yourself, it's a little bit harder to do that. So I think it's a really good idea to prompt that on a daily basis and then practice writing.
Follow-up question for that. So I like that you touched on that you kind of encourage people to write in whatever format feels comfortable for them, whether it's bullet points or long form, short form, whatever it might be. Do you ever bump into people not feeling confident about their writing to the point where they don't want to share? I mean, I know that you personally are somebody who's like, always hire the best writer. Like it's so essential to the whole process. But what do you do when you bump into that? Maybe if other people don't really always hire for the best writer, communicator, whatever it might be.
Yeah, that's totally fair. I mean, it's not necessarily a problem that we have, but I'm sure that it's certainly a problem elsewhere. I mean, I would just say communicate any way you can. So if you just want to share a code sample, like, here's a snippet of code I'm proud of today. Just, you already wrote it, so you don't have to rewrite it. You're just like, here's a picture of it. Or here's a design that I made today that I'm proud of. Or here's a change I made that I liked. Or here's a customer email. The customer started out upset, and let me show you how I turn that experience around. Like, you don't have to write anything new because you already did the work. So it's more about sharing. It's more about like sharing what you've already done versus describing again what you've done. Some people love to describe what they've done because they can tell a story. Some people are good storytellers and they can tell a story about it. Other people just share the work, or say like, I'm proud of this customer came in upset and I made them happy. Like, here's how I did that.
Yeah. So it's just a way to like crystallize, here's what I did today.
Yeah. For the benefit, first of all, of yourself, and also the benefit of everybody else. Because one tricky thing that happens in remote companies is that since people don't see each other as frequently, they don't know what everyone's doing. And you can get in the situation where people are like, well, I'm working really hard, but you know, what's Sally doing? What's Bill doing? Like, what are they doing? I don't even see their work. What do they do? What do they do all day? Like, you can get into that slightly toxic mindset of assuming other people aren't doing anything because you don't see them or you don't see their work. When in a physical space, you might see them tapping away at their computer or doing something, they're working, you know? So part of this idea of self-reflection and sharing and publishing is that you get a chance to show everyone else what you're doing and how your work is meaningful to the company. And you also get to see what other people do. who you might not normally bump into. Maybe they're on teams you don't interact with at all, but at least this is a chance to have a shot at going, oh, now I see what they do. Now I know what they do here. So, and some people here, for example, at Basecamp, use this opportunity to actually teach. So they might talk about a struggle they ran into today with some code or design or a customer or whatever it might be. And then they go like, here's what I did. Here's where I stumbled on this. I ran into this. I got stuck. And here's what we did. Just for example, just yesterday. So we're working on some new stuff. And there was a few people. It was David. It happened to be, this one was David, Pratik, and Javon, I think. I'm not sure if Flora was involved in this or not. But three of them were like struggling to figure out how to make something work right without it being incredibly complicated in code. And one of the write-ups at the end of the day was like, man, we really struggled through this. Like, I don't even know if we figured it out, but here's actually a link to where we were discussing it. And like, you can see how challenging this thing was. It kind of surprised us how challenging it was. So it's just a nice moment. And that also shows a sense of, vulnerability that's good to see. And like, David's one of the business owners here. And he's like, I couldn't quite figure this out. This is a real struggle. It's nice for other people to be able to experience that and see that other people here struggle too. Even someone who owns the place, even somebody who invented Rails, even, like he struggled with this too. So that's what's nice about documenting, is people can see this, not just people today, but people who join the company later, remotely or locally. They can read up on this and go, oh, interesting. No, like I'm not alone in the fact that I don't know everything either, So, but I think this is especially important for remote people because they just have fewer opportunities to bump into that. I've been going on. I feel like I've been ranting a bit.
No, it's all good stuff. This is all good.
Anything else that you think would be worth talking about, or any questions I can answer?
I think you really kind of touched on the key points, and you brought a lot of good points to kind of the things that people brought up in that thread. So I don't really have anything else, but it was interesting to hear your responses on this, and thank you for taking the time. Sure.
Do you mind if I ask you a question? Since you've been working remotely for a long time, like what do you think, what have you learned? What are your own personal tips on how to do this better?
I think the best teams that I have worked with in the past are, like you said, they have very documented processes. They have a really concrete onboarding process with everything you need all in one place. So you can just go in, be a sponge, soak up all of the information you need. They're really good communicators, so they're not people who leave you hanging on email threads or phone calls. They're very responsive. They're very open to ideas. So if there's things that I can bring to the table as a subject matter expert or somebody with SEO expertise, they're open to me bringing ideas to maybe their existing content strategy. So it's not just a closed off, just do your job, give us the thing we need. There's a two-way feedback loop, I guess. So that's something that's been really helpful. I think the other thing is it's really nice in the opportunities. For me as a freelancer, I don't always get the chance to even video chat with the people I work with. A lot of it is just purely email. So if they have company events or conferences, anytime I get to go out and meet the team in person, it really just strengthens the bond and it helps us communicate better after the fact. So it's really nice to be able to have a physical presence at least once. I think it just really helps make things run more smoothly.
I'm glad you mentioned that, actually. I'm really glad there's two things there that are really important around onboarding. So you brought up onboarding. Probably one of the most important things I can encourage remote companies to do is to bring people, a new employee, to bring them into a center, some town somewhere. Like we do have an office in Chicago. So when new employees start, they typically come to Chicago. And there's a few people from the company who fly in who are here as well. We spend at least a week together, at least. In some cases, it could be longer, depending on, if people have the time. But a lot of our employees have families and they can't be away for that long. But at least a few days, at least a week to get started. Because it is good to have those initial in-person physical faces and presence to get started. So that when you go off and you're remote, like you can at least put a face to the name, but more
Sure.
so you just understand people a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really, really important. The other thing we do is we have meetups twice a year. So we fly everybody into Chicago. The whole company comes into Chicago twice a year for about a week. So everyone can just get to know each other. One day is dedicated to like state of the union business kind of stuff. And the rest of it is purely social. We have other things going on, but people set up their own schedules. They work with teams. They go do things. They go see the city. They go out for lunch, whatever. And it's just like, these are these moments that are, you don't want to take that whole time up with business stuff. You want people to, again, be able to get to know each other a little bit better. So I think some in-person exposure is very important for remote teams. If you can. If you're spread out all over the world and it might be too expensive to do that, totally get that. But if you can, it's one place that's worth spending money on. And if you don't have an office, you can almost think about that expense as your rent expense. Like rather than putting money into an office, spend it to bring everyone together once or twice a year. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was nice to talk to you.
Likewise. Good luck to you. Keep in touch.
Yeah, thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye now.